Welcome to the deep dive. If you're tracking the intersection of global tech, high-level policy, and sustainable development, you know that Africa is really central to this next wave of AI adoption.
Absolutely. The promise is immense.
It is, but the path forward is, well, it's complicated.
And that complexity was right there, front and center. In November 2025, you had the G20 Summit in Johannesburg declaring AI, and this is their word, indispensable for the continent's future.
Right, an indispensable tool. That moment created a really clear, unified political mandate for accelerating AI deployment.
It did, but that's where the real story starts.
Exactly. The policy recognition is finally there, which is great. But what's fascinating and what we're digging into today is how sharply that high-level mandate contrasts with the reality on the ground.
That's a huge contrast.
We have these historic pledges, but they risk remaining purely aspirational until we solve the massive foundational infrastructure deficits.
That's the core tension, isn't it? The policy is clear, but the actual building blocks, we're talking energy, connectivity, computing power, and crucially, talent, they just aren't sufficient right now.
Not even close.
So if we don't fix that foundation, the AI ambitions, they just crumble.
So our mission today is clear. For you, the listener, we're going to unpack the scale of this infrastructure gap. And some of these figures are, frankly, jaw-dropping.
They really are.
Then we'll pivot to where the strategic, viable investment opportunities are for the global north.
And finally, and this is key, we'll detail how African institutions like the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Sustainable Development, CAISD, are essential to making sure all of this is locally owned and locally led.
Okay, so let's start with that initial policy catalyst.
Yeah.
The 2025 G20 Summit. This was more than just a typical diplomatic gathering, right?
Oh, much more. It really solidified the political will across the globe to treat AI development in Africa as a genuine priority. Our sources point to three key outcomes that created this broad policy umbrella.
What were they?
Well, first you had the formal leaders' declaration, which named AI explicitly as a developmental necessity.
Okay.
Then you got the new operational G20 Africa engagement framework for 2025 to 2030, which gives structure to it all.
So the how.
Exactly. And finally, the Ubuntu Legacy Initiative, and that really emphasized technology transfer and building local capacity.
That Ubuntu Legacy Initiative,
Yeah.
that's a strong signal, isn't it? This isn't just about importing foreign tech.
Not at all. It's about building local capabilities, and they followed up these high-level declarations with specific, actionable mandates.
Like what?
We saw dedicated G20 work streams focusing on things like subtech and regtech, that's supervisory and regulatory technology, and using AI for due diligence.
Which is critical for things like cleaning up supply chains and financial transparency.
Precisely. So the political consensus is there. It's firmly in place.
But political consensus is worthless without power, without bandwidth, without hardware. So we have to look at the implementation barrier.
And that means diving into the infrastructure deficits.
This is where those data shockers really drive home how far Africa lags. So let's start with what the sources say is the most fundamental challenge: energy.
The energy crisis is, without a doubt, the Achilles heel of AI training. These big models, they require a staggering amount of power.
Give us some scale on that.
Okay, consider this contrast. Africa's entire electricity production in 2023 was 919 terawatt hours.
919. That's the total supply for a continent of 1.4 billion people.
Precisely. Now, here's the comparison that should stop you in your tracks. Global data centers alone consumed 415 terawatt hours in 2024.
Wow.
And that figure is projected to double by 2030.
So, let me get this straight. The power consumption of just global data centers is already approaching half the total power production of the entire African continent.
You've got it. It creates an almost impossible barrier. Outside of a few hyper-urbanized pockets, frequent long power outages are common. The cost of electricity is prohibitively high.
So sustained GPU training, that intense processing you need, that's just off the table.
It's nearly impossible to do reliably. You just cannot run a modern supercomputing cluster if you can't guarantee uninterruptible power.
Okay, so if power is the foundation, connectivity is the nervous system. Yeah. And that digital divide is still a huge line of exclusion.
A massive barrier. In 2024, only 38% of Africans were online.
38%.
Compare that to the global average of around 68%. That means you have 860 million people completely cut off from the benefits the G20 was promising.
Cut off from cloud services, from real-time AI.
The whole ecosystem.
And the mechanics of this concentration issue are particularly striking when we look at the actual computing power.
Absolutely. Africa currently hosts less than 1% of the world's data center capacity,
Less than 1%.
despite having 18% of the world's population. And even that tiny fraction is severely concentrated.
Where is it?
The sources show that the vast majority of the 140-plus facilities are in just 5 nations: South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and Morocco.
So if you're an innovator anywhere else, you're at a serious disadvantage.
A severe disadvantage. And that leads directly to the issue of sovereign capability.
Meaning, if you're a brilliant researcher in, say, Ghana or Senegal, you can't build your own models because you just don't have the hardware.
Exactly. Africa has virtually no publicly accessible supercomputing clusters. So researchers and startups, they're forced to rely on expensive, distant clouds in Europe or North America.
Which means high latency, huge costs,
And most critically, fundamental questions about data sovereignty. Where is your country's most sensitive data being stored? Who controls the models built on it?
Okay, so we've laid out the deficit. Before we get to solutions, what's the quantified cost of doing nothing? What's the opportunity cost here?
It is staggering. If these gaps aren't addressed, the continent faces a projected loss of up to $1.2 trillion in potential AI-enabled GDP gains by 2030.
1.2 trillion. That's not just a missed opportunity, it's a colossal economic drain.
It is. It means stalled development in agriculture, education, healthcare, all because the tools to modernize are just unavailable.
So the G20 sets the mandate. The deficit is quantified at over $1 trillion in lost potential. This is where we shift our analysis from the problem to the viable investment blueprints.
Right.
The global north has both a strategic self-interest here, access to this huge market, and a clear moral imperative to act.
And the shift has to be immediate. The good news is we don't have to invent solutions from scratch. 2024 gave us clear, replicable blueprints.
Where the focus is on scaling up renewable energy-backed hyperscale facilities.
Exactly.
So give us the prime example of that blueprint.
The Microsoft and G42 $1 billion geothermal-powered AI data center, the one they launched in Kenya in 2024. It's the perfect case study.
Because it proves you can deploy this massive power-hungry infrastructure.
Provided you link it directly to a stable, renewable energy source. We're seeing similar large-scale investments from Oracle in Morocco and Vantage in South Africa.
That link is essential.
Ugh.
But for a billion-dollar project like that to work, what do African governments have to deliver to get that private capital to flow?
They need to guarantee stability. That means clear, specific incentive mechanisms, streamlining land availability, offering sensible tax incentives, and, most critically,
The power agreements.
long-term power purchase agreements, PPAs. They ensure those data centers have stable green energy at a predictable price for decades. The private sector will not invest $1 billion without an ironclad certainty on power.
Okay, so that's the massive data centers. But the World Economic Forum talks about the need for shared regional infrastructure, these digital corridors, to spread the wealth beyond those 5 countries.
That's the crucial next step. The WEF estimates that building between 700 and 1,000 new shared regional facilities by 2030 could unlock $1.2 to $1.5 trillion in economic value.
700 to 1,000 new facilities in 6 years. That's hugely ambitious. How do you make that realistic?
It requires a concerted effort to de-risk these projects, and that's why Northern Development Finance institutions, DFIs, and pension funds are so critical.
For our listener who might be less familiar with finance, break down the role of a DFI in a project like this.
Sure, DFIs are essentially state-owned institutions that invest in private sector projects in developing countries. Their unique role here is providing what's called first loss equity or concessional debt.
First loss equity.
What's that? It's basically a guarantee. The DFI puts in the first layer of equity and agrees to absorb the first wave of losses if the project hits trouble.
So it drastically reduces the risk for the big commercial investors.
Exactly. It makes these huge, complex regional projects suddenly attractive and bankable.
We've also seen commitments to the backbone infrastructure, the actual cables connecting these hubs.
Right. You have Google's Africa Connect Next and the Equiano cable investments. Those are critical. And you combine them with the 4 regional cloud hubs Google rolled out in 2024.
It all increases connectivity, creates local inference points so the AI processing happens closer to the user.
That's the idea.
We focused on the huge projects, but what about the 860 million people still offline? How do we bring AI to a rural farmer or a remote clinic?
That's where the conversation has to pivot to localized edge nodes.
Mm.
These are small-scale, really efficient compute facilities, often powered by their own dedicated solar or hydro microgrids.
So they're not reliant on the unstable national grid.
Not at all. And they can deliver low-latency AI directly to agriculture monitoring crop health or for remote diagnoses in healthcare.
And scaling those microgrid models seems crucial for equitable distribution.
It is. The sources suggest that if we successfully scale these models, we could potentially close that estimated $68 to $100 billion annual infrastructure financing gap that exists.
So it bridges the gap between the huge centralized investment and the on-the-ground needs.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
And none of this works without people. The talent pipeline is a huge issue, with Africa only accounting for, what, about 3% of global AI researchers?
It's a severe bottleneck, and it threatens the whole African-led part of the policy mandate. We need blended public-private programs that are aggressive and focused.
And we have blueprints for that, too.
We do. Microsoft's 2024 continent-wide AI skilling programs are one example. Another is Google's $17 million investment in African universities for curriculum and compute credits.
And those compute credits are critical.
Absolutely critical. It gives local students the actual real compute time they need to train models, which they just couldn't afford otherwise.
So we have the thesis, we have the models. What is the total financial ask to make this happen continent-wide? And what's the return for the global north?
The sources suggest a committed investment pipeline of about $50 to $70 billion over the next 5 years, so from 2026 through 2030.
A huge outlay. What's the payback?
The return is first-mover advantage and access to a hyper-growth market. McKinsey projects that just from generative AI applications alone, this could generate between $61 and $103 billion annually.
So the investment unlocks immense market value.
It does, but here's the critical point. This infrastructure will fail. It will fail to achieve its goals if it's purely imported and controlled by external entities.
Which is where African institutions come in.
This is why organizations like the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Sustainable Development, CAISD, are absolutely indispensable. They provide that local leadership and coordination.
So what's their role operationally? Are they just facilitators, or are they getting their hands dirty with model building?
They're deeply involved in both. As a Pan-African AI Center of Excellence, CAISD is positioned to run sovereign model training pilots to validate Africa-specific applications.
Making sure the algorithms are culturally relevant, trained on local data.
Engineered to solve local problems. They are moving the continent from being a consumer to a co-creator.
And how does that speed up adoption across the whole continent, beyond just those 5 nations with infrastructure?
That's where their AI Commons for Africa approach comes in. It's a really pragmatic, powerful form of democratization.
How does it work?
They openly share non-sensitive models and foundational data sets. This dramatically lowers the costs and barriers for startups and public agencies in all 55 countries.
So they can innovate immediately without having to build a massive model from scratch.
That's the goal.
And for those big global north partners, looking at that $50 to $70 billion investment, their biggest concern is always regulatory certainty.
Always. It's a huge, complex continent.
So how does CISD help there?
They function as essential harmonizers. They build partnerships with key bodies like the African Union, the African Tax Administration Forum, financial regulators like the South African Reserve Bank.
So they create predictable regulatory sandboxes.
Exactly. They provide the certainty that global partners need before they commit billions of dollars. In essence, they act as the trusted local implementing partner for these complex projects.
Offering regulatory stability and technical leadership at the same time.
They de-risk the investment by guaranteeing African ownership and African leadership. They ensure genuine technology transfer so the new infrastructure is integrated and ultimately managed by local talent.
So what does this all mean for you? Let's try to synthesize this. The G20 provided the clear policy mandate to deploy AI in Africa.
No question.
And that severe infrastructure, gap energy, connectivity, compute, it's not just a development problem. It's the $1.2 trillion investment opportunity that private capital is looking for.
And the single most crucial takeaway, I think, for channeling that required $50 to $70 billion is that it must flow through trusted African partners like CISD.
Right.
If those investments are done that way, they move Africa from being a passive consumer of global AI to an active producer and exporter of unique African-led solutions.
That's the real developmental prize.
It is.
A shift from consumption to production. A powerful ambition, but it hinges entirely on the wiring beneath it.
It does. But let's leave you with one final thought, something that builds on that tension we discussed.
Okay.
Considering that current data center capacity is so overwhelmingly concentrated in just 5 countries, what are the next crucial steps African leaders need to take? How do they ensure these proposed digital corridors achieve truly equitable distribution across the continent, especially for those vital, small-scale rural AI microgrids?
How do we stop centralization from defeating the goal of inclusion? Something to explore on your own.